Hi, welcome back. I'm Oliver Lundy, a photographer from the UK, and this video is everything you could possibly want to know about lenses. Okay, so in our previous videos, this is part of my bigger photography course series, which if you want to check it out, I'll put a link in the up there, and it's starting from the absolute basics. And in one of the earlier videos we discussed about how one of the key parts of proper camera is the ability to be able to change the lenses to suit the scenario that you're in or for the type of photography that you're doing. And what we're going to do today is cover all the different lens types, what the differences are, why you might pick one lens over another, and give you a good overview of the type of stuff that's out there and how you might use it. And then in the next video we're going to talk more details about how different lens choices will affect your images and what lenses you're going to use and where you should start building up your lens kit, because you are going to end up with more than one. So let's dive right in. So we're going to start off with this lens. This is just a basic lens and it's going to serve our purposes just to go over some of the fundamentals. So every lens will have a focal length, and the focal length is a way of saying the amount of zoom that the lens has. So we're going into more of how that affects your images in a minute, but for now it's just a focal length, and the longer the focal length, the more zoomed in the lens is, and the shorter the focal length, the wider the lens is. If you want to know what your lens is, on the front of the lens or on the top rim of the lens, there's some numbers, and those numbers tell you what the lens is. So in this case, this is an 18 to 55 millimeter. It's always done in millimeters, okay? And then the next number, which is the next most important thing to know about lenses, is the aperture. And it's normally the max aperture, and it can be a range. So some lenses, like this one, have a constant aperture where it's an f4 all the way through. If you don't know what aperture is, go check out my aperture video, then come back. Again, link in the corner there. So this lens is a constant aperture, so it's always at f4, or the maximum aperture is f4. This lens, which is the kit lens, actually is a 3.5 to 5.6. So that means that at its widest, it can go open, the aperture can open 3.5, but when it's zoomed in, it can only go to 5.6, okay? Then the other numbers are the filter thread, so how big the thread is if you want to screw on a filter, but again, we'll come to that later on. So that's what the numbers mean. So it's focal length and then max aperture. Okay, so few quick terms. Kit lens is just a term that's used for any lens that's given with a camera as part of a kit. It doesn't, and there are various different ones. Some of them are basic and are not very good, and some of them are actually quite solid as an all-rounder for when you're getting going. So what lens you should buy is a complex question, and we're going to try and cover that here, but as I've said before, go and talk to a camera shop if you've got any kind of questions that you're not happy with, or you want to know exactly what lenses are going to suit your system. What type of lenses are there? So you have zoom lenses. Okay, so this is the most common type of lenses. They can zoom from kind of wide to more zoomed in, and you can have a basic zoom lens like this, or you can have a big daddy like this, which will go from 70 to 200 millimeters. But zoom lenses just allow you to essentially pull the subject closer to you without having to physically move. The other common type is prime lenses. Prime lenses like this 50 millimeter here. These don't zoom at all. It is one focal length. If you want to zoom into your subject, you physically have to move. So why would anyone use a prime lens instead of a zoom lens if a zoom lens has got more flexibility and therefore got more usability in different scenarios? Generally speaking, prime lenses give better quality because the level of complexity needed to get a system that can move is higher than one that doesn't need to move, it only needs to focus. So therefore you can get higher produced quality optics for a lower relative price. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that they tend to have bigger maximum apertures, again for the same reason. It's harder to build a zoom lens that has a wide open aperture therefore they're more expensive. And so why is that relevant? If you don't already know, again, go and check out the aperture video, but wider apertures let in more light and therefore will give you a better quality image in low light situations, and will allow you to do more things with depth of field in terms of shallowing it out and blurring that background. So I currently use both. I think that the versatility you get from zoom lenses is really useful in some scenarios, and in a lot of situations you don't actually need the benefits that you get from primes. But I also do use primes, and I have to admit that my favourite lenses are primes, partly for the quality, for the sharpness, and for the maximum aperture. So we'll get into what lenses you should buy in a bit, but the sweet spot is probably both. So quick warning before we go any further. Lens mounts on the back of lenses are specific to a particular system, and that system is almost always specific to a particular brand. So for example, this is a Canon EFS lens, so this will fit any EFS mount camera or any EF mount camera. So you need to be careful when you're buying lenses that the camera that you have matches up to the lens system that you're looking at buying. And again, if you've got any kind of questions, just make sure you do your research before you buy anything. So that's lens mounting. And then the other thing you need to know about is crop factor. So lens focal lengths that we talked about just now, they're in reference to what that focal length would be on a full frame camera. So a full frame camera is just a 35mm sensor or thereabouts, and it's generally considered to be the kind of the standard for sort of working pros. So, but what happens when you have a crop sensor, which is the smaller sensor inside the camera, is that the relative focal length changes. So this is a 18 to 55 on a crop body that essentially behaves more like a 24 to 70, and you wouldn't be able to put this onto a full frame camera because it's not big enough to accommodate a bigger sensor. So just be aware that your focal length or your relative focal length might change slightly depending on whether you're putting a full frame lens, which you can do. So this 50mm, for example, you could put this onto a crop sensor body, it's like a 70D or an 80D or an 800D or any other kind of crop sensor Canons, but it's not going to behave like a 50mm. It will behave like more like an 85 or a 75. So depending on the body and the crop factor. So you need to be aware of that because it will affect the field of view, which we're going to talk about in detail in a second, but it will also affect the aperture. So if it's an f1.4, which this is, on a full frame camera, then it will behave more like an f2 on a crop sensor body. And if you're a little bit confused about that, don't worry so much about it for now. Just know that specific lenses are built for specific systems, and you need to make sure that the lens that you're looking at is correct for the system that you have and that you want to buy. Okay, so field of view and focal length. So focal length really only affects the field of view. It also affects the kind of knock-on effect of it is that it appears to be moving the subject close to you. Obviously it's not moving the subject closer to you, it's just cropping in and then maximizing that small field of view in front of you to your sensor, so it essentially brings the image closer to you. So I'm going to put an image on the screen right now, and this was taken on the top of one of my local car parks, just looking at a park. And the first image is a 15mm, and a 15mm is really wide. It's actually the lens that I'm filming on right now, so I'm going to cut back to the video. So right now you can see quite a lot, even though the camera is only, it's only, I can touch it, there you go. So it's really close, but you're actually getting quite a nice wide view. That's because this room is quite small. But a 15mm is very wide, and you can see you've got a lot of view in the photo, so go back to the photo. And you can even see the wall in front of the camera setup. So the next image, I zoomed into 24mm, and that crops in a bit, but it's not a huge noticeable difference. Then I went to 35, and then I went to 50, and then 70, and then 100, and then 200, and then 400. And you can see from this that 400mm is a massive difference to 15mm. So that's what focal length does. The longer the focal length, the more zoomed in to the scene in front of you you are going to get. And the wider the focal length, or the smaller the focal length, so 15 millimeters, is very, very wide, sort of 24, and below is considered to be kind of wide angle. And that's very wide, and you're going to get a lot of the scene in front of you in the photo. So just to clarify, there's some terminology here. So anything from sort of 15 millimeters up to about sort of 35 millimeters, 24 to 35 millimeters is considered wide angle. Anything wider than 15 millimeters, so sort of 8 to 15 millimeters, is super wide angle. It's so wide, in fact, that you start getting distortion around the edges of the frame. Even at 15 millimeters, you'll get some distortion towards the edges of the frame. So like if I put my hands out to the side, you can kind of see that they get really big relative to the other parts of the image. And if I put my head up to the top, you can kind of see it goes a bit mental. So there is distortion with wide angle lenses, but you do get a lot in the frame, and that only matters if you're close to the camera, the distortion, or if you're shooting buildings or something and you need the lines to be straight. But for now, just know the super wide angle is sort of 15 millimeters or below. Wide angle is 15 to 16 to 24 to 35, and then you kind of got your standard kind of 35 to 50 is your sort of normal, or it's called normal, or standard, and then anything from kind of 85 upwards is considered telephoto, and then anything over sort of 200 is considered sort of super telephoto, so 400 and above is kind of super telephoto. So we talked briefly about primes versus zooms, and you can get wide, standard and telephoto lenses in both types. And the versatility you get from zooms means that you can take one lens with you quite often instead of a few different prime lenses, but you do sacrifice a little bit of image quality, or generally speaking, you sacrifice image quality. The modern zooms are actually very, very good, and the other thing that you sacrifice is that you don't get that maximum aperture that you get with the primes. So I'm going to put up a few different examples here just to show you why you might pick one over another. So in this photo that I took of a McLaren recently, I've used an 85 1.4, this lens, where is it? This one. This lens, an 85 1.4, and as you can see when I take the caps off here, it's got an absolutely huge opening. So an 85 1.4 is massive, it lets a lot of light in, but it also really blurs out that background. And you can see from the photo that the trees in the background are completely blurred out, so all that focus is drawn towards the car. If I was to take that same photo at say f4 or f5.6 or something like that, those trees would be much more of a distracting element in this photo. So that's one of the reasons why you go for a prime lens, and the other, as I said, is sharpness. And then zoom lenses, this 70 to 200, it's been an absolute workhorse for me. I use it all the time. It's an amazing lens, and because it opens up to 2.8 is still pretty wide, and you actually get quite a lot of background blur with a 2.8, and you get the versatility of a 70 to 200 lens. So it's well worth looking at both primes and zooms. And realistically, if you're really getting into photography, there'll be a point where you just think, why not have both? And I can take the appropriate lens with me when I'm going out to shoot a particular thing, rather than carrying around a whole bag of lenses. That's one other thing. Zoom lenses tend to be heavier than primes because they've got more glass in them. But the consequence of that is that you end up having to take more primes. So whether or not 2 primes is the same weight as 1 zoom is another question. So when would you use different lenses? The easiest place to start is some standard stuff. So things like landscape photography. Generally speaking, with landscape photography, you want the whole view that you're stood in front of, because you want the majesty and the scale of the view that you're seeing to come out in the photo. So you're probably going to use a wider angle lens, so a 16 to 35 type lens. You can also use telephoto lenses with landscape photography to pick out details like a particular cliff top or a tree group or a river or something, but we're talking about general. So in general, you're going to be using a wider lens, so sort of 16 to 35. It's so much so that there is almost an entire lens dedicated to landscape photography, and the 16 to 35 is the go-to for many landscape photographers. It also happens to be really good for vlogging. So if you're going to film yourself, wider angle lenses are really useful because you can only hold a camera out so far, and you want the whole area behind you to be in focus. Like for example, I could handhold this angle, so this 15mm, pretty much as far away from me as it is now, and you can see a lot. You can see me and you can see the whole environment around me. If I was trying to shoot on a 24 or a 35, it'd be a much tighter crop and it'd be harder to keep me in the frame. So that's another reason why people use wide angle. Standard zooms, the standard zoom, so 24 to 70, is kind of like the go-to everyday lens for a lot of photographers, particularly wedding photographers. It's a really good, so 24 is pretty wide, and 70 is relatively quite tight. So if you're trying to crop out distractions and things like that, it's quite useful to get more zoomed in. It also gives you better background blur. I won't go into why in this video, but the 24 to 70 is a really good focal length, and also the 35 and 50mm primes are really good kind of everyday shoot anything type lenses, apart from obviously the extremes. So the standard zooms are really useful in lots of different scenarios, so event shooting or taking portraits, or going out and just taking pictures of the environment around you. A 35 and a 50mm, they're close to the kind of focal lengths that you'll get in mobile phones, and so you'll already be used to the type of pictures that you'll get from those, but also they're really useful in general photography. And then the sort of 85 and above, so the zoomed in telephoto stuff, that's going to be used for things like sports, action photography, portraiture, again for that same reason that I mentioned just now about how the more zoomed in you are, the more focused you are on your subject and the less distracting elements you have. We're going to go more into that in the next video. And the super telephoto stuff, so kind of like 400mm and upwards, you're talking about, generally speaking, wildlife photography, things like motor racing, or photographing airplanes, things like that, things that are very far away from you that you just physically can't get close enough to, for various different reasons. Animals, you don't want to scare them away, and racetracks and planes and stuff, you physically can't get any closer to them, so you have to reach with the lens. When you see on the side of kind of any sporting event, you see a whole host of photographers lined up with huge lenses. Those are the super telephoto lenses, and that's so they can get like the expression on the sports person's face, even though they're sat 200 yards away. So that's the telephoto end. Okay, so final quick recap. Lenses have all sorts of different types. Make sure to remember that you get the correct lens for the camera system that you have. Lenses fall into two broad categories: zoom lenses and prime lenses. Prime lenses don't zoom in, it's one focal length. Primes are generally speaking better quality and have, generally speaking, bigger max apertures, or are cheaper to get the equivalent that you could get from a zoom lens. Zoom lenses are more versatile in that you have more focal lenses without having to change the lens or carry more with you. But again, it's a sacrifice and it's a trade-off either way, so you've got to decide which is best for you. Focal length is just how zoomed in or not the lens is, or how wide it is. There's lots of ways to think about it, but essentially it's how much of the scenery in front of you, or the subject in front of you, you're going to be able to see from where you're stood or sat. And that's all you need to know about focal length for now. And that's it for lenses. So by all means, if you've got any questions, do drop them in the comments below, and I'll try and address them in a further video. Otherwise, I hope to see you in the next one. So the exercise for this week is go out and take photos of the same subject at different focal lengths. So if you've only got the one prime lens, then I'm sorry, you can't do this. But what you can do is take photos at different distances and see how it affects the images. But assuming that you've got a zoom lens of some description, try shooting the same subject wide, so a flower, a person, anything you want, it doesn't matter, as long as you can move around and take the image at different focal lengths. So shoot it wide, shoot it zoomed in, and see how it affects images, and see how wide you can go and what you can include in the images, and then see how zoomed in you can get before you actually have to start moving closer to actually get a good photo of something. So that's this week's task, and I hope you join us for the next one. just as a quick reminder, please do like and subscribe to this channel. It really does help get traction and hopefully help more photographers on their journey. And also remember that this is part of a much bigger course, so do check out the other videos, and I hope to see you in the next video.